Okay, welcome to Intro to Programming. This week we're going to be discussing Chapter 8, which is a chapter about strings. So we've already used strings almost from the beginning, but there's a lot of aspects of strings that we haven't learned yet, and so this week we're going to cover more of the things that we can do. Should be a fairly short video. I did modify my notes, so if you happen to have read those earlier this week, there's a new section basically about parsing a string, which we'll talk about. I'll go through some string functions, and maybe we'll do some examples, and that should be it. Okay, so the first thing to know about a string that's very important is that it's basically a list. It has a different notation. We don't use the square brackets, and we don't have all of the same abilities that we have with lists, but it essentially is a list and it has most of the same operations. So as an example, if we have a string called S and it just has some letters of the alphabet, these are a bunch of operations that we can use on it, and I'll go through those in the PyCharm in a bit. We can use the in keyword, which we also had with lists, and that tells you if a particular letter is in the string. So whether there's one instance, so A is in the string A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so that returns a true. It doesn't matter how many times A appears, if it's there at least once, it's going to return true. Not in is the inverse of in. That just means that it's that particular character is not in S. So a not in S is a false statement, so it returns false. We can index strings, same as lists, so starting at 0. So S of 0 is A, the very first letter in the string. S of -1, remember we wrap around to the end, so that would be the last letter of the string, which is G. We can concatenate strings, which I know that we've talked about before in terms of how do you print things. That's the plus operator. So if you put a plus sign between two strings, it concatenates them, meaning it makes a new string. Basically, kind of join the strings that are around the plus symbol. The multiplication operator, I'm not sure we talked about that, but what that does is it makes X number of copies of the string. So if the string is A and we multiply by 5, we basically get 5 letter A's. It's in a new string. Length of string, which is the same as length of a list, which is the number of elements. In this case, the number of characters. The list's the number of elements. We can do slices of a string. So if we take a slice from 2 to 4, okay, remember we're starting at 0, so 2 to 4 would be 0, 1, 2 is the C, 3 is the D, and remember it's always one less than the last number. Kind of a confusing thing about Python is ranges often we take one less than the second number. We can use the same slice operations as with lists. So if we don't have the second number, or rather the number after the colon, then that assumes that it's going to the end of the list. So S bracket 4 colon empty right bracket gives us EFG. We can iterate through a string with a for loop. We can say something like for char in S, print char, and that's going to print each individual letter. So let's go through those examples a little bit and just play around with strings. Okay, I'm going to open a console here. So on the bottom in PyCharm, you can actually open a Python interpreter window. So this is similar to what you would see in idle. or if you just started Python from a command line, which we haven't really talked about that, but I can quickly do that. So in Windows, you have something called a DOS window or shell. And if you have Python installed and it's on the path, you can type Python and you'll get a window here where you can enter Python programs or run Python programs, which looks, again, similar to what you'd see in idle. On a Mac, there's something that's probably called a terminal. Same thing, works exactly the same way. So I'm not gonna go into that any further, but just FYI that it's there. So I'm gonna do some commands here. So we're just gonna create a string of letters. Okay. And so we can illustrate some of the operations. So A in S returns true, because A is a character in S. We can do multiple characters. So if it's any substring in S, it's going to return true. So ABC is in S, but if I did AC, that's going to return false because the sequence AC is not in S. So it has to be in the right sequence. Okay, if so, any subsequence of the string, so DEF, for example, what does our string look like here? Well, looks like my string is not even in alphabetical order here. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Okay. So now that should work. Okay. Not in, okay, is just the inverse of that. So that if it's not in there, it returns true. So the letter Z is not in there. That's going to return true. We can index it just like a list. So S of 0 is going to be A. Let's try S of 12. Okay, what are we going to get? We should get an exception because 12 doesn't exist. The string is only, let's see how long our string is. Length of S, it's 10. So it's 10 characters long, which means that the last index is 9. Okay, so anything beyond 9 isn't going to work. So we can go up to 9. 10 should give us an exception. And it does, the index out of range exception. Okay, we can also do wraparounds like lists. S of -1 goes to the last character in the list, which is J. We can concatenate, so we could say ABC plus 1, 2, 3 gives us ABC 1, 2, 3. Okay, we can multiply. So if we multiply a string by a number, we're going to get that many copies of it. So we have a new string, which is ABC, ABC, ABC. Okay, I think okay, so the last one is for a for loop for C and S, print C. We're going to visit every single, we're going to peel off the characters in the string one by one, starting at the first one. And so it's just going to print each letter individually, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Okay. So back to the notes. All right, so how does a string differ from a list? We found out it's similar. So one important thing is that a string is immutable, which is a fancy word for meaning that we can't change a string. Okay, we can change a list. We can append to the end of it. We can insert new items into the middle of a list. We can delete items from a list, but with a string, we can't do that. Okay, so once we have a string, that string never changes. Now we can make new strings. Okay, but the original one doesn't change. So let me show you here. So let's say we have a string of 1, 2, 3. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then we say S times 2. So now we have this string 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that is a new string. S is still the same. S is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what happened was when we did the S times 2, we created a new string, and we can assign that to a variable, let's say t, and t has the new value, but the original one doesn't change. Okay, so that's sometimes important to know that, because maybe you're thinking that your string is different and it isn't. So here's another example of that. A good example of how that might affect your code. So in this example, we have a string s1 is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to use a function called replace, which I'll talk about in a bit. We're going to replace the character 1 with the character 5. So after we do that function, s1 is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you might think that s1 is different, because that's what would happen with a list. The list would actually change, but a string doesn't. So what happens with s1.replace, this function actually returns a brand new string, and you can see by printing the contents of s2 that it's 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so let's go ahead and look at that. Right, so we still have a string s. If we replace 1, and remember, these are all strings, so we wouldn't be able to say just 1 and 2. That wouldn't work, because we have to provide a string for each argument in this function. So we can do that, and it returns 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we replaced the 1 by a 2. But if we print s, you can see it's still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is something called string parsing. And to parse a string means essentially to read it and extract the information from it. And that's something that is very common. For sure, you're going to need to do this when we do the final project. It's something that every programmer does on a pretty constant basis. Okay, and that process is often called parsing a string. So imagine that we have a file that contains lines like the following. We have, each line contains a name, an age, a city, and a state. And you'll notice that there's a comma between each element in this item in the file. Okay. So if we were to read the file line by line, which we've learned how to do, and each line is read into a separate string, the string that we read is going to look like this. Okay. But probably we want to do something with that information. Just having a string with all the information is probably not very useful unless we just want to print it. So usually we want to extract that into pieces. We want to do something with the name, the age, the city, the state, and so we need to get that from the string. So the easiest way of doing that, if it's nicely formatted like this, is to use a function called split. What split does is it splits up a string into pieces, and it splits it around a character, or really a string. It splits it around a substring, and that's usually either it's white space, and white space is non-visible. Basically, a space, a tab, or a new line is generally considered white space, because on the screen it looks white. It doesn't have, a character associated with it. It doesn't have a symbol. Or you'll split around something like a comma, or some other symbol, like maybe a semicolon or a colon, or sometimes quotation marks, etc. Okay, but we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to split around the commas here because the commas separate the data that we're interested in. So this is a function that's attached to the string. So like other objects that we've learned about, like a list, there are functions that are part of that. Okay, so if we have a variable called string str, we can call the split function and we can pass in the comma. And what that does is it returns the individual items in that string, but it splits it into pieces based on where the commas are. So the end result of doing a split operation or function on this string is it's going to return a list that has the individual values broken out. So it's going to have John Smith, 37, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The commas are removed as part of this process. So the comma you see is because it's in a list. It's not because we split around the comma. All right. So let's go to the code again. And this time I'm going to, well, I guess I can still do it in the console here. Okay, so I've got a string called str. And if I do string.split and I put a comma between quotes, you can see it returns the items in this original string, but as part of a list. Okay. So what happens if we used a different character to split around? Okay, we could do a space. Okay. And if we did that, then it's gonna split up the string based on where the spaces are. So now it says John Smith 37, comma Cedar Rapids, comma Iowa. So you can, I think you can see if you were just to split up the string based on where the spaces were, that's what you'd get. Okay. And you can use any string. You could use I. And if we do that, then it splits it in a, well, as you would expect, I guess. It takes out the I's, and anything to the left or the right of the I's is put into a list. Okay. But generally, we're going to want to use something like a comma. That makes the most sense. Okay. So now that we have this list, so we'll call the list, we'll just call it data. Okay. So now we have a list called data, and from there we can extract into, if we want to, we can extract into variables, like we can say name equals data 0. And so now we have a variable that has the name in it. Age equals data 1, etc. Okay, so now we have, you know, variables that we can use in our program to do whatever, right? We can do other functions on those variables. We can show the user. We can put it into another format, database, or whatever. There's actually an even easier way to get the information from a list into variables, and that's like this. Okay, so let's go back to our split. Instead of assigning to a single variable, we can assign it to multiple variables. So we can say name, age, city, state equals string.str.split. And sort of magically, each variable has a value that is the corresponding item in the list. Okay, so there's 4 items in the list: name, age, city, state. And I've put 4 variables here to the left of the equal sign, and that's what we get. Now, there has to be an equal number, okay? So if I did something like, okay, I'll put an extra variable on the left. What it's gonna do, what it should do, is complain that there's a problem, and it's kind of a hard to understand error. It says not enough values to unpack. That just means that there aren't enough variables to assign to the variables. Now, what happens if we don't have enough variables on the left? So in that case, I think you're also going to get an error. Right. So you're going to get the opposite error. Too many values. So there's too many values in the list to assign to the variables on the left side. So you just have to make sure you have the same amount. Okay. So that's a handy shortcut for, it makes it really easy to take a string and convert it to individual variables that you can use in your program. Okay, so there are a whole lot of string functions, and there's a link here in the notes that you can go to, and there are, I don't know, there's probably dozens of different string functions. These are some of the most common ones in this little table here. Okay, and some of these for sure you're going to be using in your homework, or you should, in order to get to work right. So a couple of the most common and useful are lower and upper. Okay, so if we have a string, let's call this string, let's just call it L. Okay, and it consists of a lowercase characters. Okay, if we call the function upper, what that's going to do is it's going to return a string with the same string but uppercased. Okay, so from lowercase letters to uppercase letters. And there's also the opposite. Okay, so if we assign that to a variable u now is uppercase, we can say u dot lower, and now they're lowercase. Okay, so one place where that comes in very handy, and you're going to need this in your homework, is when you're trying to compare two different string values. Okay, so the example could be that you're trying to search for someone's name. Okay, so you have a, say you have a database, or you have a list somehow of names, and you want to search for that, for somebody's name. Okay, if you compare a name that is in lowercase with a name that is in uppercase, it's not going to find it. Okay, because it's not going to, uppercase and lowercase are different things in Python and most other languages. So what I mean by that is if you say ABC equals ABC, that's going to return false. And it doesn't matter if, doesn't matter if even just one of those have a different case, it's going to return false. So if you're trying to search for something in a list, let's say, and you're trying to match it up, you have to make sure that you have to ensure somehow that they're either all lowercase or all uppercase. And the easiest way to do that is just to call, doesn't matter which one. Okay, you can call lower or upper. So if we, on both sides of this equation, if we use lower, then that returns true, because ABC, which happens to be lowercase already, it doesn't matter. If it's already lowercase, it's going to return the same thing. But on the right side has a capital A, but lowercase is it. So at the end, before it compares, okay, they're both going to be, both these strings are going to be lowercase. And you can also, if you want to, doesn't matter, you can convert both sides to uppercase. Okay. That's also going to return true. So that's an important thing to know. Whenever you're trying to compare two strings, make sure that you know, is it important that they have this, is it possible that the cases are different? And is that important? And if so, then you need to make sure that you uppercase or lowercase the strings that you're comparing. Okay, another useful function is called strip. What that does, it takes out the extraneous white space, which, as I said, white space are non-visible characters such as new lines, tabs, and spaces. And if you're reading things from a file, you're often going to have that. Okay, and that can mess up your comparisons if you're comparing strings, or it can mess up printing. So you want to make sure that you usually want to make sure that you strip out that extra white space. So let's get an example of that. Okay, so let's say we have a string which is consists of numbers. The English words for numbers. Okay, so we'll call this numbers. Okay, now we can get those numbers out of there by splitting them. Let's say we'll call it nums. Once again, we'll do a comma. Okay, now we have nums, but notice that we have all these extra spaces in here. Okay, so if the original file or the original data had these spaces, and now we still have it. And fortunately, with the split command, we can split around individual characters or substrings, which means characters that are in sequence, but we can't say I want to split around a comma, but also get rid of all the spaces. Okay. So we have to do there. Okay, so we have this. So nums of the index 1 is that. So to get rid of that, we can say nums1 dot strip, and now we just have 2 without any of the extra spaces. Okay, so sometimes you have to do an extra processing step to get rid of extra spaces, tabs, and new lines, and that's just something that you have to kind of be aware of. Okay, some other functions. Count gives you the count of characters in a string. So ABCCCD dot count, looking for a C, gives us 3. There's 3 instances of C. You can also look for substrings. So you could look for the sequence, let's say ABC. So ABC occurs once in that string. Length, we already talked about the number of characters. Find is useful. Often we want to see if there's something in a string, a particular sequence. So abc.find quote BC returns, it doesn't return true or false, it actually returns the index in the string of that substring. So let's look at an example of that one. Okay, so we still got S equaling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we say s dot find 5, 4, the index is 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3. Remember, starting at 0, so it has an index of 3. 4, 5 is 3, and we can even do the whole thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 starts at the first, so that's the index of the first character in the string that we're giving to the find function is 0. We've talked about replace. Okay, replacing one substring with another, or one character with another. Remember, that returns a new string. It doesn't modify the original string. Starts with tells us if a string begins with a certain character or sequence of characters. So this could easily be A, B, or ABC, or anything else for that matter. Ends with is the opposite, and split, which we've already discussed. Okay, so with that information, you probably have enough knowledge about strings to do, I think, the homework for the rest of the year, including the final project. And I guess if there's any other things you need, I'll let you know as we go, but I don't think that you will. Okay. I think I'll skip this exercise. Let's see. Maybe something in the back of the book or the chapter. Anything in here? Okay, so let's do one example here. Number 2 at the end on chapter 8 on page 434. We'll do that program. Okay, so I've commented out this code in this file, and I'm just gonna add it to the end of it. It says sum of digits in a string. Write a program that asks the user to enter a series of single-digit numbers with nothing separating them. Program should display the sum of all the single-digit numbers in the string. Okay, so instead of asking the user to do that, I'm just gonna kind of cheat a bit, and I'm just gonna make a string like this. And what it wants you to do is it wants to add all these numbers together, okay? So how do we do that? Well, we have to get each individual number, and then we have to add them together, okay? So we have to add 8 to 3 to 3 to 7, etc., until we get the final sum. So how can we do that? Well, the easiest way is probably to index the string with the for loop. Okay, so if we do the notation of 4-digit in numbers, what's going to happen? Well, first of all, let's just print this. Okay, so if we run this, that prints each individual item from the string on one line. So every time through the loop, it gives us the next character in the string. So starting at 8, going all the way to the end, as you can see. Okay. So digit is a number, but digit is also a string. So we can't add strings together, or we can't add, this won't work. Well, actually it will work, I'm sorry. But it doesn't add it mathematically, it does something else, it concatenates it, okay? So we want to actually add it mathematically. So in order to do that, all we have to do, first of all, we need to store our running total, and we'll start that at 0, okay? So total plus equals digit, and we have to convert that from a string to an integer, okay? And we'll print the total, and we'll see if this works. So that's 45, and I think if you added these up, that's what you'd get. I don't feel like doing that in my head, but we'll assume it's correct. Well, let's make it simpler. Let's just have a couple numbers. 8 and 3 and 1 should be 12, right? And that's what we get. So if that works, probably any string of numbers is going to work. So that's pretty easy. So the things at the end of the book, it involves basically things like that. You get a string, and you split it up somehow. Either you take the individual characters or you use the split function, okay? And then that breaks the string into pieces, and from those pieces you do some processing. Maybe you have to convert it to a number. Maybe you do whatever the program asks, obviously, but it allows you to take a bigger string and convert it into pieces that you can then do your processing with. So I think I'll call that call it an evening. On Thursday, I think I might show you something else since we've pretty much covered strings. We'll see. I may show you how to use a debugger, which is a way to sort of watch your program running instead of just running it and seeing the results. You can actually kind of peer into it as it's executing. And so I think I might do that on Thursday. Obviously, any questions, let me know, and I will see you later. Goodbye.